In a quiet courtroom in Chicago, a judge delivered a $15,000 fine before the defendant even opened her mouth. No files reviewed, no testimony heard, just a decision made before she walked through the door. But this woman came prepared, not to plead, but to prove. And what happened next changed everything. This is a story about dignity, law, and what happens when silence is met with truth. Let's go back to that morning, when Aaliyah Freeman walked into courtroom 2A thinking it would be a routine check-in. It was just after 8 a.m. in downtown Chicago. The sky hung low, thick with winter clouds, and the wind had that sharp bite that made even the courthouse steps feel unfriendly. Inside, courtroom 2A was scheduled for a routine procedural hearing, the kind of hearing that barely registered on anyone's radar. Just paperwork. A quick appearance, nothing more. But the moment Aaliyah Freeman stepped through those double doors, she knew something was off. The room was too quiet. Not the kind of respectful quiet you expect in a courtroom, but a deeper kind, a silence that felt watched, controlled, like someone had pressed pause before she arrived. No one greeted her. No one nodded. Even the clerk, who normally offered a half smile or a polite good morning, kept her eyes glued to the computer screen. Aaliyah walked slowly toward the defense table, her heels making soft, deliberate taps against the marble floor. She was dressed the way she always dressed for court. Tailored navy blazer, minimal jewelry, hair pulled back, professional, precise, prepared. And yet, as she moved through that room, it felt like she had stepped into someone else's house, like she just sat down at a table where she hadn't been invited. The chairs were familiar, the lighting the same, but the energy? The energy had shifted. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught a small exchange, subtle but clear. A white clerk leaned toward the prosecutor's table, whispered something, and let out a light laugh. The prosecutor, a young man in his 30s, smiled. But when Aaliyah glanced their way, the clerk's eyes dropped. Instantly, as if eye contact itself would be too much. It wasn't new, it wasn't loud, but it was there. Aaliyah knew that silence. She had felt it before. Not just in courtrooms, but in law school, in elevators, in offices where people assumed she was the paralegal. And for a moment, her mind flicked back to that one hearing, years ago when she was still a prosecutor. The judge that day had called her the wrong name, not once, not twice, but 3 times. Her name was printed on the file, on the docket, on her badge, but he never looked up, never corrected himself. The worst part wasn't the mistake. It was that no one in the room thought it was strange. Back in courtroom 2A, she inhaled quietly, smoothing her palm along the edge of the defense table. Her case file lay closed in front of her, neat, centered. Just like always. To anyone watching, she looked calm. But Aaliyah wasn't here for performance. She was here for process, for truth, and maybe, just maybe, for a fight she hadn't asked for, but was more than ready to finish. The door to the judge's chambers creaked open. No gavel, no announcement, just the soft, unmistakable shuffle of authority entering the room. Judge Richard Monroe emerged with the confidence of a man who'd ruled over more courtrooms than conversations. He didn't nod, didn't glance at the attorneys, didn't even acknowledge the room. He simply walked in, robe billowing slightly behind him, and sat. The chair accepted him like a throne that had missed its ruler. With a sharp tug at his sleeve, he adjusted the black fabric across his chest, not for comfort, but for control. A small act, but unmistakably deliberate. Aaliyah's eyes lifted, not fully, just enough. She didn't expect warmth, but what she saw was colder than she remembered. She had read about Monroe. He was infamous in certain circles, a judge who treated hearings like formalities and due process like an outdated ritual. One clerk once called him efficient. Another said he was allergic to discussion. But those were polite ways of saying he didn't listen. He didn't care. He rested his elbows on the bench, scanned no papers, asked no questions. And then, with a voice low, clipped, and utterly devoid of hesitation, he spoke. The violation is clear. Fine. $15,000. To be paid immediately. This matter is closed. No introduction, no review of the facts, no invitation for counsel to speak. Just a decree. Like a king deciding the fate of a subject he didn't recognize. A soundless wave of confusion moved through the courtroom. The young prosecutor, who'd been rearranging his notes, froze mid-motion. His eyes darted toward the judge, then to Aaliyah, then back again, like he'd missed a page in the script. The court reporter blinked twice, her fingers hovering above the keys, uncertain whether to type. The gallery stilled. Even the shuffling of a woman's coat in the back row stopped. For a moment, time itself seemed suspended, held in place by the blunt weight of Monroe's authority. Aliyah didn't move. Her case folder lay untouched, still closed. She hadn't spoken a word. Inside, her pulse ticked up, not in panic, but in disbelief. She thought of something her old professor once told her, long ago in her first year of law school. Justice requires process. Tyranny only requires a decision. And here it was, delivered without evidence, without argument, without acknowledgement. She had come prepared to present facts, citations, constitutional grounds, and instead she'd been handed a verdict without a trial. But what struck her most, what made the air tighten around her ribcage, wasn't the fine. It was how normal it all seemed, how no one stood up, how no one gasped, how no one challenged it. They'd seen this before. Maybe not with her, maybe not this blatant. But the machinery was familiar. This wasn't just injustice, it was institutional routine. And for a brief, bitter second, she wondered how many other voices had been silenced before they ever had the chance to speak. A moment passed, then another. Still, no one said a word. The fine had been issued, the matter had been declared closed. And yet, Aliyah Freeman remained seated, eyes steady, hands folded, heart beating in a slow, firm cadence under her blazer. She didn't speak right away, not because she was afraid, but because she understood the power of pause, especially in a room that expected her to react. Then, with the kind of grace that made silence tremble, she rose. Not abruptly, not to make a scene, but slowly, deliberately. Her right hand touched her chest, just lightly, as if reminding herself to breathe from the center. And then she spoke. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "With respect, I haven't been heard. I've not been allowed to speak." Her tone wasn't defiant, it wasn't angry, it was simply true. And for that, it cut sharper than any raised voice ever could. The room didn't shift, but something within it did. Like air being drawn back before a storm. Judge Monroe blinked, as if annoyed that the scene hadn't ended when he said it had. He leaned back, lips tightening, and spoke with the kind of smirk that wasn't born from humor, but from power left unchallenged too long. "Miss Freeman," he said flatly, "this is not a stage. We will not entertain speeches this morning." His words came down like a curtain, final, dismissive, meant to shrink her back into silence. But Aliyah didn't shrink. She didn't drop her gaze. She didn't ask permission, because she knew her rights. And more importantly, she knew her worth. "With respect, Your Honor," she replied evenly, "this isn't a performance. This is due process. And I'm entitled to it, just like every citizen who steps into this courtroom." No tremor in her voice, no shift in posture, just stillness, the kind that makes even the loudest gavel feel small. For a fleeting second, the room took another breath, as if unsure what would happen next. And in that breath, a quiet realization stirred among those watching. This wasn't just a lawyer asserting procedure. This was a woman, a black woman, standing tall in a system that expected her to bow. She wasn't asking for justice. She was demanding the space to speak it. Aliyah didn't move right away. She stood still, eyes level, breath measured, like a pianist waiting for the first note to land in perfect silence. Then, without a word, she reached down and opened her case folder. Each motion was deliberate. She didn't fumble. She didn't rush. Because she had rehearsed this, in her mind, in front of her bathroom mirror, in every courtroom that had ever made her prove herself twice. She laid the first page on the desk in front of her, then the second, then the third. To most people, they looked like ordinary legal documents. But to Aliyah, they were shields. And this courtroom? A battlefield. She didn't look up as she spoke. Her voice was steady, sharp, but not loud. The kind of voice that didn't need volume to carry truth. "Let's talk precedent," she said. "Because what's happening here, it's been tried before, and it didn't hold." She raised the first page, tapping the top corner. Sullivan v. State of Illinois, 2017. A defendant fined under municipal code. No photos, no inspection report, no affidavit. Just one officer's word. The appellate court reversed the fine in full. Their ruling, where there is no evidence, there is no enforcement. Due process demands more than assumption. She paused, letting the silence absorb every syllable. Next, she unfolded the second document, crisp and annotated. Henderson v. City of St. Petersburg, 2019. Officer issued a $12,000 fine based on visual observation. No timestamp, no written notes. The city claimed it was standard procedure. The court disagreed. The ruling, administrative authority does not exist in a vacuum. Fines must be based on verifiable fact, or they are void under constitutional review. A flicker of motion from the gallery. A subtle shift, but real. The court reporter glanced at Monroe. The prosecutor straightened his back. A young woman sitting in the back row leaned forward, her brows furrowed, not in doubt, but in dawning recognition. Then Aaliyah raised a third page. Her hand no longer steady, but firm. Bryant v's City of Tallahassee, 2021. A sanitation worker fined $10,000 for a code violation. No inspection, no corroboration. The court called it exploitation. Their words, a fine without proof is not justice. It's institutional convenience dressed as law. She lowered the page, but her eyes remained up, locked on the bench. Your Honor, she said quietly, $15,000, no documentation, no hearing, no argument allowed, just your word, and respectfully, that is not justice. Her voice lowered, but sharpened. That is authoritarianism in judicial robes. The words hit harder than a gavel, and this time the room responded. The clerk began typing again, faster now. The prosecutor, previously relaxed, was now fully upright, hands clasped tightly together. Even Judge Monroe moved, just a twitch of his jaw, a glance down at the papers in front of him, fingers tapping once against the polished wood of the bench. But Aaliyah didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She just stood there, firm, collected, and painfully precise. And the room, the same room that had once looked past her, was now looking at her. Listening. She had taken back the floor, not by shouting, not by pleading, but by reminding everyone present that law without process isn't law at all. Judge Monroe didn't speak right away. He stared at Aaliyah like a man trying to decide whether to push forward or pull back. But his silence wasn't thoughtful. It was tactical. Calculated, tight. His fingers drummed lightly on the bench, uneven, off rhythm, not a habit, a reaction. And Aaliyah saw it. She didn't break eye contact. She didn't blink. The documents still lay neatly spread on the table before her, legal cases that now sat like loaded weapons, undeniable and steady. And behind them, her hand rested flat, firm, as if anchoring not just the paper, but the principle. The room held its breath, and then Monroe shifted in his seat, straightened, cleared his throat. This court, he said, voice lower than before, will recess for 15 minutes to review procedural matters. No explanation, no acknowledgement, just a quick, clipped announcement wrapped in a veil of control. He stood before anyone could speak. The bailiff moved quickly to open the door to chambers, and Monroe stepped through it without another word, his robe trailing behind like a flag retreating from battle. He didn't look back. And that, more than anything, told the truth. This wasn't a break, it was a withdrawal, a tactical escape disguised as decorum. Because Judge Monroe had just felt something he hadn't felt in years. Doubt. Aaliyah watched him go. She didn't exhale, she didn't move. She remained standing, back straight, hands still resting on the stack of precedent she had just unleashed like controlled fire. She wasn't waiting, she was witnessing. And what she saw was this. A man who had spent years commanding courtrooms, now stepping out of one, not to think, but to calculate. He wasn't looking for justice. He was looking for leverage. For a phone call, for a loophole, for a way to silence what had already been spoken too clearly. But it was too late, because the silence that followed his departure wasn't the kind that follows a ruling. It was the kind that follows a shift. The room had tilted, not because Aaliyah had shouted, not because she had demanded, but because she had stood and refused to move. And now, with Monroe gone, the courtroom didn't feel still anymore. It felt unsettled. Like it had just realized who really held the weight. And Aaliyah? She stood as she had from the beginning, unshaken, unmoved, and more commanding in stillness than Monroe had been in power. 15 minutes. That's what Monroe had asked for. But the room knew better. There's a kind of stillness that doesn't feel like waiting. It feels like watching a fuse burn. Aaliyah remained exactly where she had been, standing, silent, steady. Her hand still on the folder. Her eyes fixed straight ahead. She wasn't just holding her ground, she was the ground. Then the door to chambers opened. But it wasn't just Monroe who returned. A second figure walked in behind him, taller, older, wrapped in a black robe that seemed to carry more weight than fabric should allow. Judge Thomas Whitaker. The name alone pulled a hush over the gallery. Federal oversight, retired appellate, a man known for rulings that could flip cities upside down. He didn't shout, he didn't gesture, he didn't have to. Even the court officer stood straighter, as if instinctively sensing the shift in gravity. Whitaker walked with the slow, intentional gait of someone who didn't need to prove he belonged. He simply was. Where Monroe had performed power, Whitaker embodied it. Monroe trailed slightly behind, his shoulders no longer squared, his eyes down. Whatever control he thought he had ceded the moment Whitaker stepped through that door. When they reached the bench, Monroe cleared his throat, voice thinner than before. "For the record," he said, "I have invited Judge Whitaker to observe and, if necessary, provide guidance on certain procedural matters that have arisen." The words sounded official, impartial, measured, but everyone in that room heard the truth underneath. This wasn't oversight, it was rescue. Monroe had lost his grip, and now he needed someone bigger to steady the walls before they collapsed. Whitaker didn't even sit. He stood beside the bench for a moment, glancing at the case file laid before him. Then he turned toward Aaliyah. His eyes were sharp. Not unkind, but surgical. He wasn't assessing what she wore or how she stood. He was measuring something deeper. Her preparation, her grounding, her threat. And Aaliyah? She met his gaze. 1 full second longer than necessary. Not in defiance, but in declaration. She knew what this was. She was no longer just defending herself from Monroe. She was now standing trial in front of the system itself. Finally, Whitaker spoke. His voice was clear, even, impeccably controlled. "Miss Freeman," he said, "you've raised several constitutional concerns regarding the enforcement of Municipal Code 22F. I would like you to restate your core argument for the record." It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't even a request. It was a test. A live audit with power watching. A lesser attorney might have fumbled, might have looked down, repeated notes, reconsidered tone. Aaliyah did none of that. She didn't shift, didn't flinch. She simply straightened her spine 1/2 inch and replied, "Yes, Your Honor. I'll begin with the due process violations supported by appellate precedent." Her voice didn't just respond, it landed. And just like that, the room, once Monroe's arena, now belonged to her. Because in the space between Whitaker's question and her answer, something sacred had been restored. The law was finally being heard by someone who came to speak it. The bailiff called the next name. "Officer Nathan Ellis, please take the stand." A man in uniform rose from the back of the room with practiced posture. Upright, composed, unhurried, he walked like someone used to being watched, used to being obeyed. His navy jacket was crisp, his badge gleamed. To anyone unfamiliar with the case, he looked the part. Authoritative, professional, reliable. But Aaliyah wasn't watching the shine. She was watching the space between his answers, the quiet places where truth tends to hide. He took the oath with ease, then sat in the witness chair and folded his hands across his lap. Like this was routine, like this would be easy. Aaliyah stepped forward, not aggressively, not dramatically. Just enough to close the distance between question and consequence. "Officer Ellis," she began, her tone neutral, "you issued the citation that resulted in the $15,000 fine against me, correct?" He nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." "And that citation was based on a violation you personally observed?" "That's correct." She paused. "Did you document the alleged violation with any photographs?" "No, ma'am." "Did you file a detailed incident report?" "No." "Any diagrams?" "No." "Witness statements?" "None present." "Footage from a city camera?" "Not necessary." His voice remained calm, polite, but a faint edge was beginning to form, the kind that appears when confidence starts to sense pressure. Aaliyah tilted her head slightly. "Was anyone else present at the time of this supposed violation?" "No," he said. "I was alone." "So, to be clear," she said slowly, "you issued a fine of $15,000 based solely on your personal assessment, with no physical evidence, no written record, no third-party verification, and no supporting documentation?" Ellis's jaw tightened. "I've been doing this for over 20 years. I know a violation when I see one." And there it was, the statement she had been waiting for, the shift from facts to feeling. She let the silence hold for just a second longer. Then, with the gentlest tone she'd used all morning, and the sharpest edge beneath it. She spoke. "I'm sure you do, officer. But we're not here to debate instincts. We're here to talk about evidence." She turned back toward the bench, voice calm but unmistakably direct. "Your honors, what we have here is not enforcement. It's assumption, not process, projection. Officer Ellis didn't record a crime. He interpreted one, and then treated that interpretation as law." Her gaze returned to Ellis, steady, unwavering. "Can you point to a single item in the citation file, anything at all, that constitutes physical, verifiable proof?" He looked at her, then at the bench, then back again. "No, ma'am," he said, more quietly now. Aaliyah didn't gloat, she didn't smirk. She simply let the weight of his answer settle like dust over the courtroom. And then she gave them the line that no one in that room would forget. "What you issued wasn't a citation. It was your opinion, in uniform." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was electric. Aaliyah lowered her voice, but the room leaned closer. "I wish I could say this only happened to me." She opened her folder once more. This time, not for statutes or rulings, but for names. Names, real people. Each one like a pin on a map of quiet devastation. She lifted the first page. Daniel Rhee, a Vietnam vet from Tulsa. Spent 20 years running a small garage, helping anyone who couldn't afford repairs, especially other veterans. One day, the city flagged his license, said he'd missed a checkbox on a renewal form. No warning, no call, just closed. Within months, he lost the shop, then his home. A pause, a breath. Her fingers tightened slightly on it before setting it down. They sent him a letter of apology. No signature. She didn't look up. Not yet. She reached for the next one. Karen Bautista, master electrician, 15 years of spotless work, until the city quietly rewrote a licensing policy, and suddenly her certification didn't transfer. No one explained what that meant. She lost her contracts, her team. Eventually she left the state. Another breath. Aaliyah blinked once slowly, but she didn't stop. The final story was the shortest, but somehow the heaviest. James Weller, retired trucker, built a fence with his own hands. It crossed the city's property line by 17 inches. They fined him $10,000. When he tore it down, they fined him again for incomplete demolition. She laid the last page beside the others, forming a row of silent indictments. Then she looked up. Her voice was steady, but lower now. Not just softer, but deeper, anchored. "Let's not pretend this is about me anymore. It never was." She let that land. The stillness in the room thickened. This is what happens when rules become weapons. When no one asks if a fine is fair, only if it's filed correctly. When the system doesn't care who it crushes, as long as the paperwork is clean. She turned her eyes toward the gallery, not just the bench. These stories don't show up in case law, but they're everywhere. People who didn't have a folder, or a voice, or a second chance. She looked back to the judges, and this time even Monroe didn't look away. "Today I stood here because I knew how, but Daniel didn't. Karen didn't. James didn't." Her voice dropped to a whisper, but it carried like thunder. "So I'm standing for them too." The silence after Aaliyah's final words wasn't empty. It was thick, heavy, alive. And it stayed that way for several long seconds, as if the room itself was processing what had just unfolded. Then slowly Monroe leaned forward. His voice, when it came, no longer carried the weight it once did. But he tried. "This court," he said, "retains judicial discretion. We are not required to accept every argument." But he didn't finish, because Aaliyah stepped in, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a tone that sliced cleaner than any objection ever could. "Discretion," she said, "is not a sword for bias, nor a shield for error." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Her words didn't echo. They landed. Flat. Final. Unflinching. Whitaker shifted. Slowly, deliberately. He hadn't spoken since asking her to restate her case. But now, as the weight in the room tipped fully in his direction, he placed both hands gently on the edge of the bench, and spoke. "I've heard enough," he said. The entire room stilled. "Miss Freeman is correct. Judicial discretion cannot override constitutional standards. It cannot substitute assumption for fact." A pause. "In this case, we have no documentation, no witness testimony, no verifiable evidence." He looked not at Aaliyah, but at Monroe. Not with malice, but with the quiet gravity of someone handing down truth. "This court cannot and should not uphold a fine built on subjective belief alone. If we do, we set precedent not for justice, but for unchecked power." Then, the final words, Clear, firm, irreversible. Accordingly, the fine is vacated. The charge is dismissed. No one cheered. No one clapped. But the silence broke, like a glass that had finally cracked under pressure. The court reporter's hand stopped moving. The prosecutor leaned back slowly, as if exhaling something he'd been holding in for far too long. And Aaliyah? She didn't smile. She didn't drop her shoulders. She simply closed her folder softly, like sealing the end of a chapter. Because for her, this wasn't a victory. It was a correction. And justice, when it finally came, hadn't come with fireworks. It came in full sentences, clear logic, and undeniable law. The gavel never dropped. There was no slam of finality. No commanding voice sending the court into recess. Just stillness. The kind of stillness that comes after something breaks and something better begins. Aaliyah gathered her papers in silence. No rush, no triumph, just gravity. She turned to leave the table. And as she passed the bench, Monroe, still seated, still silent, spoke softly. I underestimated you. He didn't look at her directly. He couldn't. His voice wasn't full of anger anymore. It carried the weary tone of a man who'd just seen his own reflection and didn't like what stared back. Aaliyah paused. Not for long. Just enough. You wouldn't be the first, sir, she said. Then she walked. Each step across the courtroom floor felt measured, like punctuation, not to an ending, but to a statement that had finally been allowed to finish. She passed rows of silent faces, some stunned, some reverent, some wide-eyed, like they'd just witnessed something they weren't sure was even possible. She didn't meet their gaze, but they followed her with theirs. The heavy doors of the courtroom opened, and the morning light spilled across the marble. It caught her back, her shoulders, the edge of her folder, and it followed her out. Because what she carried now wasn't just a legal file. It was precedent. And precedent moves fast when truth finally clears the way. Weeks later, a small headline appeared in a city paper. Municipal Court reopens review of over 300 citations. Soon it wasn't just one city. Other lawyers began filing appeals, citing Freeman v. Municipal Code 22F. Communities long silenced began to speak. Clerks revisited old files. Journalists started asking new questions, and in barbershops, kitchens, church halls, and schoolyards, people of color began to talk about justice like it was possible again. Not because the system had changed overnight, but because someone had stood up and made it blink. Aaliyah never gave interviews. She didn't run for office. She didn't write a book. But somewhere, in a city hall meeting, or a courtroom, or a folded flyer posted on a community board, you might hear her name whispered. Not as a hero, not as a headline, but as a woman who reminded the law what it's supposed to protect. A black woman, standing alone, and the entire legal system finally standing still to listen. This wasn't just a story about a courtroom. It was about standing your ground, even when the ground seems to shift beneath you. It was about truth, dignity, and the quiet power of refusing to be erased. If this story moved you, even just a little, please give it a like. Share it with someone who needs to believe that justice is still worth fighting for. And don't forget to subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories, where we bring you real, meaningful stories that stay with you long after the screen fades to black. Your support means the world to us. Every click, every comment, every share helps our small creative team keep doing what we love, telling the kind of stories that matter. Because here at Mr. Mac's Stories, we don't just tell stories. We honor voices, we challenge systems, and we remind each other that the fight for justice is never over, but it's always worth it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.